This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not medical advice.
Today, we're talking about couples, the delicate balance between safety and intimacy, trust and faith, and what it truly takes to remain kind and connected when love is tested. Welcome back to the Happy, Healthy Her podcast, the space where we empower, discover, and inspire women in midlife and beyond. Today, we're talking about couples, the delicate balance. Well, that's repetitive. Let me move on. Welcome. I'm Lorraine Keim. I'm your mindset wellness coach and your host for today's conversation. And as always, I'm joined by my two dear friends and co-hosts. Ladies, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tracy Mail. I'm a health empowerment coach.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Penner, and I'm a menopause health coach and author of the Menopause Map book series.
Nice.
Wonderful. So today is our guest, Bruce Chalmer, a psychologist based in Vermont who has spent more than 3 decades working closely with couples as they navigate some of the most meaningful and sometimes most difficult moments in their relationship. Through his teaching, consulting, and writing, his ideas have supported not only couples, but also therapists seeking a deeper understanding of how relationships grow, heal, and evolve. Together with his wife, Judy Alexander, he also hosts the podcast Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Welcome, Bruce.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to some episodes of your podcast as well.
Oh, nice.
Welcome.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
That's great. So, Bruce, tell us what first inspired you towards couple therapy. And as you look back over the years, what lessons have stayed with you and what differences have you seen emerge over time?
Wow. Yeah, interesting questions. What inspired me to get into it, I think a lot of therapists would tell a similar thing, events in my own life. Earlier on when I was younger, I don't know how many folks are listening and how many folks can see it, but I am not, well, you mentioned I've been doing the couples therapy work for 30 years, and I didn't start until I was almost 40. I'm now in my mid 70s. So I had a career before that. I was actually a statistician. I was also teaching courses in data communications. I was doing all kinds of stuff that, I enjoyed. But it wasn't until I bumped into a crisis in what turned out to be my first marriage. I'm now in a second marriage for 21 years. But in my first marriage, that I encountered the power of therapy. I encountered some experiences both as an individual and also doing couples work. And, I had various therapists in various modalities, and some of it was really good, and some of it I now look back on and saying, nah, that really wasn't so good. But all of it was powerful. And I just found myself drawn to being part of it. And so I already had a PhD in psychology, and I kind of got clinical training after that. And got licensed and did internships and got licensed and stuff. And I was working a lot with individuals and also with couples and also with families. Something about the couples work just felt right. And I've been asked that question and I haven't got a really tight answer other than saying, if you talk to a lot of therapists, you will find there's the folks, broadly speaking, they're the folks who say, oh, I love working with couples. And they're the folks who will say, oh my God, I couldn't possibly work with couples. And I'm, of course, in the former category. There's something about it that is so, first of all, it's a huge privilege. This is true of individual therapy too. It's a huge privilege to be invited into someone's world like that. And I'm so inspired by the struggles people go through in just being so deeply human, trying to figure out some really painful stuff. With couples, it just feels like it's so immediately present, and the ramifications are so large, it seems to me. To not only for the individuals involved, of course, it's huge. If they're in couples therapy, it's because there's something seriously important happening. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother doing couples therapy. And there are kids involved and families involved and communities involved, and healing a couple, which doesn't always mean staying together, of course, but whatever that means, healing a couple is really part of healing the world more generally. And it feels like a calling in that way.
Nice.
Great. So, the other part of my question, have you seen differences emerge over time?
Yeah, doing it for 30 years. And so here's the old, I mentioned I used to be a statistician. My old statistician brain kicks in. It's like, well, there are multiple factors in how I'm going to answer that question. One is there's me, I'm 30 years older than I was 30 years ago. How the heck did that happen? But there it is. So I think I see some differences because I'm different, as I see some things
Right.
that I wouldn't have seen. And possibly that's because I'm sure there have been cultural changes that have happened over those decades, but also it's my ability to see them or not that has changed as well, or, particular things I focus on. But there have been some trends I've noted, and of course, curious to hear, in a podcast that's especially for women, and here I am trying to avoid mansplaining, to the expert women in the room. But that I have noted some what I find interesting differences in how one talks about gender that were different, 35 years ago when I started doing internships than they are now.
Mhm.
And to me, it feels like you can be more sophisticated about that than at one time. There was a period of time where in certain contexts, the very idea that men and women are characteristically different in interesting, ways, not, obviously there's lots of individual variation, but that very idea was sort of anathema in some circles. And more recently, it's like, no, that's not so anathema. It's like, no, it's okay to talk about that now. Things of that sort. I don't know. That seems to have been the culture has changed a lot over time.
Wow. Yeah, I agree.
Especially, you're saying because it was so the roles and the individuals were so defined back then. The woman had to do these things and the men had to do those chores or whatever, right? So, and now it's completely flipped. The guy stays home with the kids and the wife goes out to work, and it's quite different, right?
Yeah, that has been really an amazing change. As you're pointing out, it's like a sea change statistically.
Yeah.
That just never used to be the case. And here I am, old guy, and remembering, when I was a teenage boy, and the assumptions. Again, I'm speaking in broad averages here, but the assumptions that one would make are so different for my kids' generation and my grandchildren's generation. It's so different in terms of what the possibilities were. I'm remembering being in kindergarten in the 1950s, and some grown up is saying, "Oh, boys and girls, what do you want to do when you grow up?" And all the boys would say sometimes absurd things like cowboy or whatever, but oftenly what their daddies did. And there were only three choices for the girls. That's all they ever came up with. I'm sure that can't be true even then. I'm sure that wasn't actually true. But all they could be mommies or teachers or nurses. That's all any of them would say.
Right.
And so that's
it's great. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't even know. Obviously there were other options, but I don't think we weren't aware of them. Now we're aware of everything. I always think about that when I was younger. Well, they didn't have forensic science back then, but I absolutely would have gotten into forensic science. I love that kind of stuff. And when it first came out, and again, I was, I don't know, in my 20s or 30s, but I was like, oh, I'm too old to learn that stuff now. Like, but yeah, it's funny. I wasn't right at the time. I could still if I wanted to, but yeah, it's just funny. It was, I think, just the lack of access to information. We only, like you say, you knew what your mom did, you knew what your dad did, and maybe an aunt and uncle. You just didn't have a broader range of information at your fingertips.
Oh, and of course, enormous cultural obstacles placed in your path for those few who did. How difficult it was, of course.
Oh,
the options weren't there, right? Like I remember being a teenager in the 80s and girls had to take sewing and cooking. It wasn't till I finally got into grade 11 that they finally allowed girls to take mechanics. Like it wasn't an option. Like we were placed like this. But I do have a question for you, Dr. Chalmers. The podcast, when Lorraine said your title, Couples Therapy in 7 words.
Yes, right.
7 words.
Very short episodes. Yes.
Well, I'm thinking it stands for something. I'm thinking it's not just 7 words. Can
Yes,
you
thank you
elaborate
for.
on what they are?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, the origin story. It's a sort of funny title, isn't it? The origin story of that. It's a 7-word formula. Came up with early in my private practice. I don't know the exact how many years it was, but it must be like 27, 28 years ago now, where I remember this setting. It was a consultation group meeting we were having I think it was in my office actually, with, I don't know, 5 or 6 colleagues. We would get together, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this in your various roles. We'd get together and we'd talk about our work. And so we must have been talking about couples work, because I don't even remember, but I know on the way out, we were literally getting up to leave. And this colleague, and it was a friend of mine, turned to me and said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" Which is like kind of one of those, really standing on one leg. You want me to answer that question? So but I had thought about it. I'd had sort of, I bounced around conversations about that. I said, well, if you really boil it all down, if you think about, well, what am I really trying to convey to people? It was only 5 words at that point. I was trying to convey, be kind and don't panic. Because, by kind, I don't just mean be nice. I mean, be kin. Recognize your kinship,
Mhm.
especially for a couple, that partly what's slipping is that sense of kinship, that sense that, oh, we are on the same team, even when we disagree, aren't we? Well, not necessarily when they would come to see me. And you can't do that if you're in a panic. So be kind and don't panic. And so I started sharing that with a few people, some of the couples I work with. And they say, well, that's interesting. Um, One catch though, I mean, I get the connection. It's like, yeah, if you're panicking, you can't be kind. Tell me, how do you not panic? And they had me there, because the only answers I had there was just don't, which doesn't say anything, does it?
I
Right.
know.
So, and I still don't
As I
have
said
a
so.
wonderful, I don't have a great answer, but I do have a description, because I thought about that. If I thought about the couples I was working with, this is, over a period of a few months after that question started to emerge. I thought about, there's some couples who come in, and there's something about their mindset that says they're gonna wrestle with this. They're gonna work on this, even though it's painful, even though they're angry, even though they're hurt. And there's other couples who would come in and take the kind of quintessential example of infidelity. So I have large numbers of the folks I work with. One of my books I wrote about betrayal and forgiveness, because I do a lot of work with couples where that's an issue. So sometimes couples would come in, and let's say they're dealing with infidelity, and what they would be saying, both of them, the one who cheated and the one who was cheated on, whatever, they would both be saying, look, we just want to go back to how it was. It was fine if he or she hadn't done that stupid thing. And they're saying it of themselves. If I hadn't done that stupid thing, I don't know, I must have been crazy, must have been drunk. We just want to go back to how it was. And the one who was cheated on is saying, yeah, damn right. And moreover, I'm going to monitor his or her, whatever it is, cell phone, and I'm going to be
Oh,
their probation officer, and that's going to be it. And we have to find a way to get back to trust, because I'm not going to try, whatever.
Right.
That mindset didn't work well. And
No.
a lot of the work we would be doing was getting to the mindset of the other folks. And the mindset of the other folks were, they would come in and, for example, let's say, it isn't, of course, it isn't always this way, but let's say it's the man who cheated and the woman who was cheated on, obviously heterosexual couple. And she's saying, look, I know he's not crazy or evil, but he did it's a terrible thing. And he's saying, yes, I shouldn't have done that. It's a terrible thing. And she's saying, and I wish we could go back to how it was, but we can't do that, because there must have been something meaningful about this. As
Mm.
painful as that is, what was happening in our relationship that would make an otherwise decent guy I know to be a decent guy, he always
Mhm.
has been, do that. And the guy is saying, again, if they're demonstrating this mindset I'm talking about, the guy is saying, yeah, I wish I could just dismiss it as this horrible aberration, and I was having a bad day, or I was pissed off, or whatever. But I can't. I'm not crazy. I don't think I'm evil, but I should. I feel terrible. I shouldn't have done that, but I did. We better figure this out. That's the mindset. And so what do I call that mindset? I call it faith. Not
Mm.
religious faith, but faith that says this whole life business is meaningful. It's, even though we don't have all the information, but we got to work with it. And so the couples that would manifest faith would be the ones, that's the antidote to panic. They would say, well, this sucks. It's painful. It hurts. We're hurt, but we're going to work with this. That's the mindset that gets you through. So the 7 words, if you have to count and to get 7 words, are be kind, don't panic, and have faith. So that's the 7 words. So just to finish off how we got that title for the podcast. So the first book on relationships I wrote came out on February 29th, 2020. Now, if you remember the end of February 2020, guess what happened right away? So all of a sudden, everything, the world shuts down, right? So all of a sudden, we can't do any in-person, promo events for the book. The book's called Reigniting the Spark. That was my publisher's suggestion. I was going to call it Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And he said, basically, that title sucks. He's probably right. So he knows more about it than I do. So we were going to call it that. But anyway, we couldn't do anything. So we did a Facebook Live. And I say I invited my wife to join me because she's great on that stuff. And Judy Alexander, the aforementioned Judy Alexander. And so we did that, and people said, "Oh, you guys are great together. You should do a podcast." And so we've been doing it ever since, just because it's just fun. We enjoy it. And you guys, you know that.
Yep.
I hope you know that.
Yeah.
This podcast is audio. Like, not a lot of people can see us, but as soon as I asked you that question, me, Tracy, and Lorraine, you could see we all grabbed our pens and our papers, and we're sitting here poised, ready to hear the 7 words. Like, for anyone who didn't see that, that's what we did. I had it written down.
I didn't pick it up, but there they are. You can find them on. Well, actually, you go to our. We actually have the domain name couplestherapyin7words.com, but we shortened it. We got an alias for it, CTN7, the numeral 7. CTN7.com is our podcast website, or BruceChalmer.com. That's my practice website that has a link to it as well. Mm-hmm. And you can get it, like we all say, you can get it on all the podcast platforms as well.
Right. I do have another question. Kind of goes in with all that. I saw that in your book, you talk about how communication usually isn't the issue, right? Yeah. That is not the problem in a relationship. That kind of shocks me. So I would to know what is. Yeah,
the title was intended to shock a little, of course. Okay. That is, of my books, that is the most snarkily titled book. And I want to mention the subtitle too. Yeah, it's called "It's Not About Communication: Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong." That's snarky. Is that snarky or what? So why would I name? Yeah, and you're asking the key question. Come on, everybody. Why do I write a book like that? Not everybody, almost everybody who shows up for a first session is saying we need to communicate better. Mm-hmm. They're not crazy. Of course, I understand what that means. They're saying when they're trying to talk about anything that's more controversial than pass the salt, and sometimes even pass the salt, they get into a fight, or it's really unpleasant, or they get shut down, or, I get that. That's what they're saying. The reason I'm saying that in the large majority of the time, it's not about communication is because often what people will think, and what many therapists and many books will teach, is communication techniques. They'll say, well, you need to learn how to communicate. You need to do I statements, and you need to do active listening, and you need to practice nonviolent communication. And I'm saying those things trying not to sound super cynical, because all of those are good ideas. The problem, though, is they don't help at all if people are actually communicating very effectively. The problem isn't that they're not effective communicators. The problem is what they are communicating very effectively. What they are effectively communicating is often, like John Gottman's 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. They're very effectively communicating those things. You can dress that up with I statements, and they're still going to be expressing contempt. And you've probably heard folks do this, and there was this, did you ever see the, this is dating me, the movie, The Four Seasons? I think it was from the 1970s. So that was like before some of your time, but and it had Alan Alda and Carol Burnett, I think, in it. But just last year, Tina Fey made a limited series called The Four Seasons, based on the same premise.
That's what I saw.
Yes, you saw that. Yeah. Well, you may remember. Did you see the whole series?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. You may remember this one hilarious. I found it hilarious send-up of a couple that had been taught these communication techniques. And Tina Fey was one of them. I forgot who the guy was in the couple. And so they would say, I need a moment. And they would go into a stance, where they're holding hands meaningfully, and they're very carefully crafting what they're saying. And of course, it was brilliant send up because it was utterly absurd. It accomplished absolutely nothing. because they're doing that. The trouble with communication techniques is you do that instead of actually saying what you want to say.
Right.
And then people, if you're in a panic, they help not at all. You can't follow the rules. And if you're not in a panic, they're unbelievably cumbersome. And as I said before, it's the idea like of I statements, a classic one that that we've all told people about or learned about. The classic thing about I statements is that's sort of more or less what a well-functioning conversation looks like between two people who are relaxed with each other, not angry at each other, maybe have some differences, but that's sort of what they're doing, isn't it? They're not yelling at each other. They're not insulting each other. They're not criticizing each other's character. That's sort of what I statements are about, right? But they're not thinking, let me say this as an I statement. They're just talking because they're fine. They're not upset. The problem with communication techniques is they are designed, well, my favorite metaphor about that, you know how tennis players, like the top tennis players, they often grunt loudly when they hit the ball.
Yeah.
So that means if you want to be a top tennis player, you just have to learn how to grunt, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that is the what's the Latin? That is the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. See, I'm a recovering nerd with
It's a mouthful.
yeah.
Yep.
Well, it just means what does that mean? The after, therefore, because of. In other words, it's saying they're not top tennis players because they grunt. They grunt because they're top tennis players.
Right.
If you want to be a top tennis player, you're going to have to learn how to hit the damn ball. And then maybe you'll find yourself grunting, but it's not about the grunting. If you want to be a well-functioning couple, teaching you to speak as if you were won't make you a well-functioning couple. So that's, now I find interesting exceptions. If somebody, for example, what we used to call Asperger's, and they don't use that term anymore formally, but because it turned out not to be, specific enough. But there are certainly some folks who, for whatever reason, their brain is wired such that they have a hugely difficult time reading someone else's emotions. They can't tell if their partner's happy with them or pissed off at them or whatever. Yeah, that is a communication problem. Or literally, I've occasionally met couples where they barely speak each other's language. I mean that literally. If they're talking to me, at least one of them speaks English, but the other one may speak very little English. Okay, that's a communication problem. None of that is solved with communication techniques. It's solved with language instruction.
Right.
And same thing with folks on the spectrum. There are folks who will teach those skills to people who have that difficulty. They learn how to spot things consciously that most of us don't have to think about consciously. But that isn't about communication techniques either. So there's and I have to add one thing. 'Cause I mentioned the snarky subtitle, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. I do point out in the book that applies to me too. Everything I quote unquote know about couples therapy is wrong too. The problem isn't the ideas. We all got good ideas. The problem is thinking they're the last word. Turning them into ideologies that does harm rather than good.
Very interesting.
An analogy sorry, Lorraine, an analogy for what you just said, Doctor, would be what you said earlier about pass the salt. If you're so engrossed in communication techniques, if let's say you want the salt, instead of saying, pass me the salt, an I statement, it's, well, I went to my doctor and he has my blood pressure a little bit low, and I think I need to add salt to my diet, and I need to make sure that I drink enough water so that I don't stay up all night pee. And you're having this long conversation. At the end, your food is cold and you didn't get the salt.
Yes,
because
exactly.
you exercised all the communication techniques, right?
And utterly mystified the person who was sitting by the salt.
Yeah. Like,
saying,
what?
what are you trying to tell me?
What do you want? What do you need?
What,
Yeah.
You got to pee? What?
Which is not to say, look, it's nice to say, please pass the salt. In other words, I don't claim that, well, let me come around to, I was talking earlier, I think you mentioned, Lorraine, in introducing me, that notion of what safety versus intimacy, or I call it stability and intimacy. They're both really important. But what I point out is that for intimacy, and of course, what do I mean by intimacy? By intimacy, I mean more than just sex. I'm talking in much more broadly. When you feel alive, when you're present and honest with yourself and each other, those are moments of intimacy. Nobody can do that 24/7 because I get distracted myself. But to be able to do that, you have to tolerate anxiety rather than avoid it, because it's a little scary to tell somebody, it's lovely when all you want to say to somebody is something nice, something you know they're going to want to hear, telling someone you love them. Although that's terrifying the first time, isn't it? But even just telling somebody something that, expressing an opinion you're pretty sure they agree with you about, that's not scary. But just what about a couple where you just want to give a garden variety complaint? You just want to say, hey, I wish you would, do XYZ you're not doing, or I wish you wouldn't do XYZ you are doing. Or what if you want to express something that you're worried your partner will find scary? Like, I haven't wanted to tell you this, but I sort of want to try this thing in bed we've never tried, and I'm worried you're going to think I'm weird. Or even outside the sexual domain, I want to say something about, I've had this dream of opening a business, and I'm worried you're gonna freak out at the notion. Or I have this dream of, living somewhere else for 6 months, and worried you're gonna, get all upset about it, whatever. Especially if they have a history of getting upset about stuff like that. People then tend to shut themselves down. And that itself, my whole thesis about stability and intimacy is they are both needs. In other words, if you shut things down, or avoid rocking the boat in the interest of stability, it doesn't work, because eventually lack of intimacy itself becomes destabilizing. We can't tolerate it, as human beings. We want to feel alive. If we're in a situation that doesn't feel alive, we will. I liken it to a plant going, cracking a sidewalk. The energy for growth. It'll try and crack the sidewalk. And when a couple does that, they end up talking to the likes of me.
Yep.
Well, before I go into the next segment, I was wondering, since all of us have this, as we were talking about, the stereotype that it's a communication problem, has that been replaced by something else, like another word or another phrase or another issue? Or is it just not just as simple as communication, and there's a whole other complicated way to do it? Or is it like, well, it's not complication, it's X, if someone were to say?
I love that question. I'll tell you why, because a year ago, I would have fallen all over myself trying to find a way to answer it. But the most recent book I wrote has a title that I think, and it's funny, this is the first time I've been asked that question. And I think, I think I've got an answer. Yes, I now call it, instead of a communication problem, I now call it the passion paradox. Call it the passion paradox. And really, it's stuff I was just talking about, really. The paradox is that the needs for stability, which are, by the way, I'm not knocking stability. It's every bit as important. The need for stability and the need for intimacy are in conflict. Yet they are both needs. And I love putting the word paradox in the title of a book. I also have a video course that has that same title. And I love that notion of paradox, because I don't think the answer is to find balance. It's not balance. They are both simultaneously needed with all their contradictions. So there's a paradox involved. But that, I think, is the simplest answer I can come up with, I think, to your question about, well, all right, if it's not communication, what are you going to call it? Because before I would have been saying, well, it's this, stability and intimacy thing, and yada, yada, yada. But now I've got a term for it. So.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I like that.
Thank you.
That's nice. That's nice.
So about your methods and why they work, I think that we can all relate to this. And I know that it's stability and intimacy. And I think I did my own maybe personal translation to safety. And the reason that I did that was because, as you were saying, somebody wants to communicate, they want to express, they want to share something, and they're afraid.
Yes.
Either of being rejected, of being laughed at, of not being, thought of well. And so I, in my mind, said, well, that sounds like safety, like not being safe,
Yeah.
And so that feeling of wanting to be safe or stable and then wanting to be close and intimate, how do you help couples navigate? And I guess I don't know if you want to call it balance anymore, but navigate that opposing forces, I guess.
Yeah.
And what seems to help them stay connected when those desires started to feel like opposing instincts.
Yeah, no, that's really, I think that's at the center of the work, is how do you navigate that? That is a difficult thing to navigate. Yeah, the interesting thing, I think interesting, the thing about safety, which
Mhm.
is I think that's a great translation. It's basically what it's about. The thing is, you can't what part of my thesis here is that in order for intimacy to be possible, you are inevitably taking a risk. You
Right.
can't be intimate without, if you have to feel perfectly safe, you will never be intimate.
Uh,
And that turns out to be awful. You know what I mean? We don't tolerate that either. So there's this, you have to be able to tolerate the anxiety of risking intimacy. And so to tolerate anxiety, there are no guardrails perfectly, because
mm,
by the very nature, it means, well, tolerating anxiety means, yes, it's going to be a little scary. It's going to be scary. And, one of the things I almost invariably tell a couple in the first session, my little mini lecture about stability and intimacy is always part of the first session. That's what happens. And when I talk about stability first and then intimacy. And when I'm talking about stability, I almost always will say to the couple, it's funny that I feel like a bad Borscht Belt comic or something. I've got shticks, I've got my shtick. So one of my shticks is I will say to the couple, and it's funny because in a first session, my first sessions are quite structured. After that, it's really free form. But the first session, it'll always be about 15, 20 minutes in, after I've got some background stuff and family diagram and stuff like that. And I'm starting to talk about stability and intimacy, and talking about stability. I'll say, well, I think I know something now that we're old buddies because I've known you for 17 minutes. I think I can tell something about the two of you, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong. But as far as I can tell, neither one of you is batshit crazy. Is that right? And they will usually smile, and often someone will say, "Well, you haven't seen me in my worst moment." I understand that, and I always point out, look, I don't want to make fun of serious mental health issues, which of course exist, right? But what I mean by batshit crazy, you can look that up in the DSM. What I mean by that is something like if somebody is floridly psychotic, having schizophrenic or having a manic episode or something like that. And that is very rare in an outpatient practice. So almost always my assumption is correct. No, they're not nuts.
mhm.
And that statement is a statement of faith. When I was talking about faith, that's what I mean by faith. I start with that assumption. You're not nuts. And, basically it's the trifecta. You're not crazy, you're not evil, and you're not stupid. None of the above.
Mm.
Because that's almost always true. I just start with that assumption. I mean, we all have our, variations on all of those things, but fundamentally, you're a valid person to be who you are, and you're doing the best you can because that's what we're all doing. So if you start with that, this, believe it or not, is answering your question, I think. If you start with that, that's what allows you to tolerate that anxiety. It's like, well, yeah, it's going to be tricky, isn't it? How do you know if you're safe enough to bring something up? Guess what? You don't. You just don't. You can hope you are, and certainly your partner can facilitate it by not being a total jerk, as we all are capable of being on occasion. But it certainly it makes it easier if you actually are with someone who really does seem to want to hear what you're saying, even though it may be uncomfortable. But fundamentally, that's what it boils down to. It's that faith that says, well, okay, so if this doesn't go well, I guess we'll try something else, but I'm willing to try it.
Right.
So that's really a lot of what the work is. And what I am embodying in a session is really that sense of faith. What I'm trying to convey, and I mean it genuinely, it wouldn't work to fake it. What I'm trying
Right.
to convey is, oh my God, you all three of us in this conversation are valid people. Four of us in this one, but you know what I mean, and the couples
Yeah.
therapy one. We're all valid people. And we're doing the best we can here. Me too. And so let's see what emerges if we can actually be honest about that, if we can actually risk that. And so that's what I'm trying to facilitate for people. And early on, it's difficult. Early on, if they're often they come in, they're angry, they're hurt, they're all sorts of good reasons. That is difficult. But that's what the work consists of a lot is fostering that sense of faith.
Well, what's great about you saying that is it does two things. Not only do you say you're not, batshit crazy or whatever, it not only allows each of them to say about themselves, no, I'm not crazy. I have a real valid point here. I have a real valid reason to be here. But it also, I think, subconsciously gets them to also admit that the other person isn't either.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
so if they can just have that split second, I'm not crazy, and oh yeah, I guess they're not really crazy either,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we're here for a reason, that really is a great way to start,
Well,
that
yes.
faith you were talking about.
It's often one of those, I mean, that and the whole stability intimacy thing is a light bulb moment.
Absolutely.
And it's more than subconscious. It's like it's quite conscious,
Yeah,
because often they may be, even if they're not saying it right away, they may be thinking, well, I'm not crazy, but I think he or she is.
true.
And or and people come in with
Right.
labels, and they've been diagnosed, or oh, some well-meaning therapist has hung labels on folks. One of my favorites, not favorites, is borderline. Borderline is what you get when you've pissed off your therapist. And if you pissed off your therapist enough, and that's, I don't mean to sound as cynical as that sounds.
Yes.
And I have to say, let me put in a word for DBT, dialectical behavior therapy,
Right.
which is very respectful. It's not dismissive of people's humanity, but that particular one, what they used to call the personality disorders in general, narcissism, that's the latest. Everybody's
Mhm.
narcissistic.
Yes.
Well, we all are to some extent. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's these things get bandied about as like cudgels at
Mhm.
people, and that tends not to be helpful. But again, that conveying that sense of faith, absolutely, Lorraine, that it's very explicitly starting with that assumption.
Yeah.
And in 30 years of doing this, how often have I not been inclined to say that? A handful of times. There's somebody who's okay. The problem here is you are floridly psychotic, but it's pretty rare in my practice.
Right.
Hmm.
Thank you for that.
Mm,
Good. Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll move along.
Yeah.
indeed.
Good.
Oh, for someone listening right now who may not recognize themselves in this, maybe feeling a little distant, a little uncertain, or even a rupture in trust, which we talked about is a lot of maybe why couples come in, where might someone begin? Not to fix everything, but to
Mhm.
just move in a healthier direction for themselves.
Well, I don't know if you saw my website or something like that, and I'm almost embarrassed to give the answer I'm about to give, but I'm going to give it because it sounds so self-serving, but I'm going to give it anyway. I just developed a video course, which is almost entirely designed for exactly those people. It really is designed for folks who aren't thinking they want to do couples therapy, aren't necessarily thinking they even want to do therapy. And it's a course, it's in three parts, and you can do them one at a time, so you don't have to, pay for all three at the same time. And it really outlines a lot of the stuff we were just talking about, and it's I mean, it's not interactive in real time. In other words, it gives you a
Right.
lot of exercise. You have to work. It makes you
Mm,
work. And it's very much addressing what you're talking about. So, I mean, if I can answer that in more general terms than just buy my course, go buy my course. But what is that about? What it's giving you is an understanding of those concepts, that starting from the very one that says, okay, we're starting off with the assumption that you're not crazy and you're not evil and you're not stupid. Starting from that sense of, okay, you are a valid person to be what you are, whatever pain you're in or doubts you're having or whatever. Let's work with that and then find meaning in it. So, and the stability intimacy thing is often, that's, as I say, it's often a light bulb moment. And so, it's funny. I developed that course because it's funny. It took me like decades to realize this. Well, the course thing, I've only had the capability of doing more recently, but it occurred to me. I mentioned in the first session, I'm sharing this with folks, routinely in the first session, and I had the sudden, well, duh moment when I realized, oh, I could actually create a course so people don't have to be in a session to get that. I've written about it in books, but I could
right.
create an interactive course that goes a lot deeper for people because it invites them to apply it to their own, very specifically apply it to their own situation and give that light bulb moment. And it would be I'm realizing it's a great precursor to doing
Mm,
couples therapy. If you do
yeah.
that first, you've already understood a bunch of stuff I think it's really crucial to understand. And then you've saved yourself a bunch of sessions of therapy.
Yeah, that's great, because a lot of times some people need that. They need that precursor, that kind of introduction into, or that kind of self-awareness, that kind of, like you were saying, don't panic.
Yes.
A course like this can take someone from a panic state to a not panic state, so that they are more open, more available for next steps.
Yes. That's more or less what part one of the course does.
Yes.
Part one of the course starts you off by understanding the whole stability and intimacy thing and the fact that you're not nuts, and takes you through I think the last part of part one is a lesson that they call them lessons on the platform I'm using, about how to know whether to call it quits or not. And it is quite explicitly so, very much biased towards saying, if you're not sure, don't split up yet. Now, again, there's plenty of situations where, oh my God, if you're being abused, that's a whole different story. But if you're not sure, I have a clear bias that says, yeah, if these aren't clear deal breakers, by which I mean like logical deal breakers, like, oh my God, we just realized one of us wants to have kids and the other doesn't, and we're really dedicated to that, and it's just not going to work, and that's a bummer because we love each other. That's a deal breaker. But merely, and I don't mean to trivialize this, but merely being unhappy could be growing pains. You might be able to recover from that and actually be grateful you did. So my general stance on growing pains is, don't break up too soon. You might end up breaking up, of course, you have that option, but don't do it too soon, and you'll just have to learn this with someone else.
Yes.
So that's part one of the course, is all about getting you there. Then part two is about learning skills, learning that mindset, that how do you develop that mindset of faith and everything that goes along with that. And part three is about making very specific action plans that apply to your specific situation. But just part one is, I think that's a great precursor to doing any sort of therapy, especially couples therapy.
That's great. And they can find that course on your, go ahead and give us your website.
Bruce Chalmer, brucechalmer.com. And if you like, and I'll invite you to all decide this, I'm happy to put a discount code for 20% off for listeners of your podcast, if you like.
Wonderful.
Thank
And
you.
if you just tell me, what would you like the discount code to be? Like I did one for someone else, and the name of his podcast is Retrieving Sanity. And he said, oh yeah, use retrieve. So should I say Happy Healthy Her or something like that?
HHP?
Yeah.
HHH.
HHH. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Hubert Horatio Humphrey, but that dates.
That too. Just don't offer to his people.
HHHP. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
That'd be
I will do
fantastic.
that.
Thank you.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm
Very
happy to do
nice.
that. Yeah.
That sounds great. And we'll make sure to have all of your links and that bonus as well in our show notes.
Great.
So, ladies, anything before we wrap up?
Oh, no, I just thank you so much, Bruce, Dr. Chalmers. This is fantastic. Very, very good conversation. I appreciated this. Yes.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and I appreciate being on.
Yep.
Nice.
I wanted to thank you also. Thank you so much for coming on and teaching us those seven words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
And
Perfect.
thank you.
Well summed
Yes,
up.
you got it.
That's good.
Thank you very much.
As the host, I did have those words already written because I had researched, but that's okay. I've been taking
I saw it too.
now. So, today's conversation may not have been easy, but it is one most of us share. Relationships can bring our deepest love and joy, and also our deepest hurt. If something from today stayed with you, we hope it was this: that there is always hope for renewed connection, safe intimacy, and faith in love can endure. Thank you, Bruce. Thanks so much. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate you sharing all of your insights today and your experience. So I appreciate this.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And bye for now. Remember, it is never too late to be the you are meant to be.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Happy Healthy Her podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with anyone you think would benefit from the topics we're discussing. We'd love to hear from you. DM us with your thoughts, comments, or ideas for future episodes. And don't forget to check out the links in our bio if you'd like to connect with any of us or learn more about what we do. Until next time, remember, in a world where you can be anything, be kind, be happy, and be healthy.